everybody. My name is Lainey Rose, and I'm the event manager here at East City Bookshop. It's wonderful to be with you all today. Thanks so much for being here in person and for tuning in virtually if you are tuning in that way. First up, some housekeeping details. Number one, if you need a bathroom, it's upstairs back past the greeting cards. Number two, we will have time for questions tonight for both in-person and virtual attendees. So even if you're watching via Zoom, you can participate. Please put those questions in the Q&A feature so that we will see them and can ask on your behalf. And most importantly, if you need to purchase a copy of any of our authors' books, we have them upstairs and we'd be happy to help you out with that. All those copies can be purchased prior to the signing line. It has been a wonderful Pride Month at the shop. We have had so many events that have discussed lesbian bars, queer literary fiction, sapphic historical romance, and polyamorous thrillers. Our events calendar is always full, so please check out our website. For more information. We also have 14 book clubs at the store, one of which being Queering the Narrative, which I run. I know we have so many all the time. The one that I co-run with my colleague Kit over there is our queer safe space, where every month we pick a genre and then we read any queer book within that genre to discuss how the conventions of the genre affect telling a queer narrative, which, surprise, that's why we're here tonight. Where do you think I got the inspiration? So always check out our website to see when our upcoming book clubs are, and we'd be happy to have you join us. The Limelight series itself was born from this idea of shining a light on the various heritage and history months throughout the year and using those events as a way to give back to our community. Each of your ticket donations tonight will be going to Smile, a local organization right around the corner from us that supports and empowers LGBTQ youth in the Washington, D.C. area. And I'd love to introduce Ty from Smile to tell us a little bit more. Welcome, Ty.
Thank you. All right. Hi. Thanks, everyone. My name is Ty. I use they, them pronouns. And I've worked at Smile for 2.5 years. And as Lainey Rose said, we are right around the corner on 7th Street. And we are a all-encompassing youth center for queer and trans youth ages 6 through 24. So I have the privilege of working with our youngest kiddos from 6 through 13. And they are a fun and rambunctious bunch of delightful queer children. We're actually doing a summer camp that starts up next week. And so we are in like full crazy mode getting summer camp ready. How many of you ever went to summer camp as a kid? Yeah. Did any of you have the privilege of a queer summer camp? Yeah, I'm really excited about it. No shade to your summer camps. I'm sure they were great too. And so that's a lot of what I do. But at Smile, we also have drop-in programming and services for ages 13 through 24. We also have housing programs, and one of our rad housing interns is here. And we also have clinical services to provide free mental health services for individuals and groups, as well as parents. So we are doing a lot of different things to support queer and trans youth in the city. It is June 29th. I don't know if y'all are feeling the end of Pride energy. We've done a lot of things in the last month, but we know that Pride is year round. So we appreciate the support all the time. There's always more things that we're growing and expanding to do. So yeah, thanks for supporting us tonight. And I'm looking forward to this event.
Thank you, Ty. We love Smile and all the work that they do. I will now introduce our authors and then we'll get to why we're here for the evening. So Kosoko Jackson is an adult rom-com author and a YA author who works as a digital media specialist to pay the bills. He lives in New York City with his golden retriever puppy Artemis and spends too much time listening to Halsey and Taylor Swift. A Dash of Salt and Pepper is his sophomore adult rom-com, not quite. He is a 2023 Lambda Literary finalist for his debut rom-com, I'm So Not Over You. Wait, Kosoko, you won that, right? Kosoko? Yeah, come on out. Oh. Yeah, he's a winner now. Spectacular and amazing. The Forest Demands Its Due, which has been called a gruesome modern fairy tale that gets its claws right in you from the start, is his next book. I got it off the website. I don't remember who said it, but I read it and it was great. So thank you, Kosoko. Steven Spotswood is an award-winning playwright, journalist, educator, and author of the Pentecost and Parker Mystery Series. He is the winner of the 2021 Nero Award for Best American Mystery, a two-time finalist for the Lambda Literary Award for LGBTQ Mystery, and a 2023 Edgar Award finalist. He makes his home in Washington, D.C. with his wife, young adult author Jessica Spotswood. Jessica, we love you. Please welcome Steven Spotswood. Hello. And then last but certainly not least is Timothy Janovsky, who is a queer multidisciplinary storyteller based in Washington, D.C. He holds a bachelor's degree from Muhlenberg College and has a self-appointed certificate in rom-com studies. When he's not daydreaming about a young Hugh Grant, he's telling jokes, playing characters, and writing books. He's the author of Never Been Kissed, You're a Mean One, Matthew Prince, and the forthcoming new adult. Please welcome Timothy Janovsky. Okay, hello everyone.
Hi.
Welcome. I'd love to kick this off with each of you telling us how you got into the specific genres that you write and what drew you to those genres in the first place. Anyone start, feel free.
Is this on? Now it's on. Amazing. I came to writing romance. Well, so I write romance, I write queer LGBTQ rom-coms, mostly male romance. And I came to writing that through YA. So I started out my writing career writing YA novels, mostly with cishet protagonists, very straight. A lot of times they had female main characters. And at one point in my writing journey, I had written a best friend character who was queer or queer coded, and my agent was like, hey, he's pretty interesting. Do you think maybe he could have his own story? And I was like, no, I don't think so. I was like, oh, they don't do stuff like that. And then as I kind of came into my own and learned about my own journey and who I am as a person and started to identify as queer, I was like, oh, wait, if I'm the protagonist of my own life, then he can have his own story. So now I write queer rom-coms by way of that. But I started reading like Jennifer E. Smith and like all those really fun kind of, I don't want to call them girly, but they were kind of like fun, frilly rom-coms for teens.
Is this on? Yeah. So I got into mysteries when I was very, very little. Like I was one of the kids that read all of the Hardy Boys and then transferred to all of the Nancy Drews. And this was pre when there was a massive YA section. So then immediately I went to the adult serial killer shelf. But I think mysteries have been my comfort food since I was very little, and it feels weird saying that a genre that's all about murder is a comfort food. But I was thinking about this just recently, that like mysteries, I like mysteries because I think a lot of people like mysteries, especially if you grew up in your childhood was in some way rocky. Like if the world around you was not a certain place, then having a genre of fiction where if you're smart and you work hard, you will figure it out, and by the end of the book you will solve everything that can realistically be solved, aside from death. And so like that's just mysteries have stuck with me since I was a kid, and now I like writing them because I can create this structure that's super familiar and comforting to a lot of people, and then hang a lot of fun stuff on it. Like it's the scaffolding that I get to just drape a lot of like fun shit on. Yeah.
So I write everything, which makes this a little bit of a difficult question.
Which is the reason I wanted you on this panel.
Oh, thank you. So I write science fiction, I write fantasy, I write horror, I write rom-coms. So for me, I got started writing YA science fiction back in the day. My first two books are science fiction books. I got started writing speculative fiction because it's what I would gravitate to the most when I was younger. It's what I enjoyed the most. YA science fiction is one of the like second most underrepresented genres, I would say, just because there's a inclination that teens don't want to read science fiction. Right or wrong, it's always been something incredibly interesting to me, so that's kind of why I kind of started writing it. And then partially because writing is like my secondary job, I look at it like a business, and so I'm very lucky that my agent literally lets me write whatever I want. Jim McCarthy, it's the greatest agent of all time. And so not every agent lets you do that. Jim is very much like, if you want to write it, sure. If we can sell it, let's write it. And so I bounce around to whatever kind of like the wind blows. I write it rom-coms because we were in the pandemic and it was hell and I needed something comforting. I'm shifting more into horror now because as I've gotten older, I found a very interesting fascination with like blood and gore and like the concept of like but just more how like horror represents like the issues at large in our community and like takes an abstract concept and makes it a physical beast. And I'm also very interested in cannibalism as a theme. Not like I want to experience it, but like I just like if a book has cannibalism in it, I love it. Any story of cannibal that like going to that level of atrocity for human nature. So yeah, great way to continue this conversation.
Excellent. Yeah, truly.
I haven't found much good cannibalism like books yet.
So now you have to write a cannibalist rom-com.
Oh, what? Oh, but that's already out. That's that movie, Body and Bones and All with Timothy Chalamet. That's a cannibalism rom-com, romance.
Which kind of leads me into my next question of what my friends who are in our Queering the Narrative book club know that this is how all of our book clubs go to, where it's like, okay, and that leads us into our next question of what were some of the first books that you read in the genre that have inspired you? And do you feel that any of your work has been informed or inspired by other authors? I love it when authors do a head tilt.
Oh, yes. Thinking head tilt.
We're like dogs.
Yeah.
We're like, This is actually what we do all day in front of our computers. We sit down, we put our coffee, and then we go, And then we just stare into the middle distance for a while.
Are we allowed to give controversial answers?
Sure.
I know, like what type of lead up is coming after that. I don't read that much.
I don't feel like that's particularly controversial.
Okay, great. Awesome. Because like I read a lot more when I was younger. Like
Yeah.
I lived an hour away from like any friends that I had. So I like devoured books. They were like the very typical books, like The Book That Shall Not Be Named was one of them that I of course devoured. Also the Aragon series. The Bartimaeus trilogy. If anybody knows the Bartimaeus trilogy, was very formulated for my younger self. Also the Pendragon series. But as I've gotten older, like I don't read as much anymore, but I get a lot of my inspiration from like movies, generally themes that like I don't think like a director did well, and then I'm like, how do we like do that better as a screen?
I love it.
Yeah, a lot of what I read on a regular basis, like I am mystery and crime wise, I'm kind of a basic bitch. I have read all of the John Sanfords multiple times, all of the Michael Connellys. Like I just love, like, if you're putting out a book or 2 books a year in the same series with the same protagonist for 30 years, yeah, give them to me. As for inspiration for my particular series, so when I was little and just discovering that mysteries was my comfort food, I was spending a lot of time at my grandmother's house, and she had a ton of Rex Stout in her little bookshelf. And Rex Stout was a mystery author who wrote from the 1930s to the 1970s, and he wrote the Nero Wolfe series, which was revolutionary because it took the classical drawing room English murder mystery and paired it with the American hardboiled voice. So you had like Nero Wolfe, who is the misogynistic genius who didn't like to work, and then you had his like right-hand man, who is the protagonist of the series and whose point of view we see things through, who talks in that like very American hardboiled noir patois. And I really enjoyed those as a kid, and I rediscovered them as an adult, and like I flat out like took that template for the Pentecost and Parker series. Like, just I was like, this is great, let's take this and add psychological realism and lots of trauma and lots of queerness, and let's just go.
Amazing.
I think the first like books that made me really like ravenous for reading and made me want to start telling my own stories was when I was younger. I read the Lemony Snicket's A Series of Unfortunate Events. And it was
very queer coded.
Yes. Yeah. Oh my gosh. I could go off on how Isadora and Duncan is Isadora Duncan. Anyway, she's a gay icon, but that's not the point. I was just going to say that, like, that was the first time that I sat down to read a series of books where I was like, Mom, we have to go to the library right now. Like, we have to go because I need to know what's going on. I also really loved the voice of those books. And I know Lemony Snicket is not like a rom-com author, although Daniel Handler has written like YA romance novels, kind of. That voice like permeates probably everything I write. There's like a little bit of sardonic kind of tongue-in-cheek cheekiness about it. And so that has followed me forever. But I started writing romance in earnest when I like pivoted away from YA and into romance, and I wanted to write a queer romance, was also during the pandemic because I was looking for comfort food. And the first, like, I guess I want to say I had read romance before that, but the first time I sat down and was like, oh, I could write this, was when I read Emily Henry's Beach Read. That was a single POV first person present tense, which was the style of story that I'd already been writing. And I was like, oh my gosh, I didn't know you could tell a romance like this. And I just felt like kind of something cracked open, and it was like, okay, well, what can I do? Like, how can I match that? Like, how can I take my lived experience as a queer person and create a story that feels the way this story made me feel? And so, yeah, I think that answered your question.
Yeah, it did. And in all this conversation about genre, I'm curious to, so much of what drives genre is the staples of the genre, the conventions, the beats that you follow in the story. So how do you as a writer feel that are you tied to the conventions of your genre, or do you try to break away from it? Is that something that you are conscious of in your writing process?
Okay, I'll fly with this. Yeah, it's something I'm very conscious of in the writing process, because it's sort of something that I consciously wanted to play with. Like when I first started writing it, is that like the mystery genre, especially like the Agatha Christie, Rex Stout, like there are tropes galore. Like the very like Fortune Favors the Dead, like the first book in the series is a locked room mystery. And I was like, yeah, let's have fun with this. Let's do a locked room mystery. And like the second book is the big city detectives go out of town and go to a small town and get in trouble, which are all like super. And then like the third book is my serial killer book. And so like I am very aware of the tropes and the conventions of the genre. And I also I do like to find how I can subvert them or have different or have fun with them in a way, because I don't want to just like lead people down the same garden path that they can get in anything else. Like I have fun characters. I'm in a really interesting place and time. How can I mess with this? Or how can I like how can I queer the narrative of the mystery convention?
Roll credits.
Yeah, no, it literally is, because like I'm constantly thinking, because it's like all my series takes place in the 1940s, and my main character is a bisexual woman, so I'm constantly thinking about like how that point of view takes these tropes and these situations, and like I have to rethink like how they will work and like what the place and time is gonna do to them and her. And yeah, that was a little bit rambly, but
Yeah, I'm writing romance. I mean, there's inherently the promise we make to readers, which is that there will be a happily ever after at the end of the novel. So in order to make that a kind of satisfying journey, you have to be able to beat by beat build a story that's going to be believable enough. I mean, there's a suspension of disbelief that happens in every romance, but like we have to lay the groundwork for that happily ever after. And so I'm very aware of that. So my first two books, Never Been Kissed and You're a Mean One, Matthew Prince, I was very much going back to like old school texts that were telling you like this is when they kiss and this is when they that, and I was like, okay, well, how do I map this on to queer folk? Because I'm really interested in the idea of queer time, which is that like, you know, people in the LGBTQ community don't exactly hit their firsts, quote unquote, at the same time that our straight peers do. So how do we stretch and bend the tropes and the beats of these stories in order to accommodate these wonderful, beautiful characters? So by the time that I started writing New Adult, which is my novel that comes out in August, it's a time travel romance. And so instead of it being like friends to lovers, it's friends to lovers to enemies to friends to lovers to friends to lovers. Like, I mean, that's a mouthful, but they're slipping through time and they're queer, and it's just like it's one of those things where I was like, okay, like I already played with the rules. Now I can bend them at my will if I want to. So
I think my answer is pretty much the same as Timothy's. Queer time, queer stories function differently than I think straight stories do. I also think like Black romances also function a little bit differently too. So this double intersectionality makes the story different. I also think there like is some beat expectations that rom-coms have different than romances. And when we like I think there's a little bit of wiggle room in rom-coms, but when you go too far, it strays into just like a contemporary story that has romance in it. And going too far into that, I think, is a very fine line. Since we have so many rom-coms that are published now, how do we set ourselves apart and be different? So I do try to, but as like a queer Black author, there's always levels that if it goes too far, then there is something lost on, frankly, often a white female reader. There's a disconnect there that can be reached.
So as we're thinking about, the considerations that we have for writing queer stories within that genre. Are there any specific tropes that any of you want to talk about that have been interesting in your writing process of go, oh, I would love to do this trope, but because I'm writing a queer story, I have to re-examine how I'm telling the story? I just saw your eyes go so wide.
Yeah. Okay. So in Fortune Favors the Dead. Okay, so in like hard-boiled noir fiction, things like certain things happen. Like you're like fedora wearing, cigar smoking, badass detective is always sleeping with the femme fatale and getting the shit kicked out of him. Like these are just beats that happen in like tons of noir fiction. And in Fortune Favors the Dead, there is a scene that came up where Will, my protagonist, has the invitation to sleep with the femme fatale, who's not really the femme fatale, it's different, but like we'll call her that. And I have her I'm like, if I had, this is like when I remember when writing the first draft, I actually like came to that crossroads and I'm like, if I have her do this book would become like the end of this book becomes something very different, and the series becomes something very different. It becomes like less hard PG-13, more soft R noir. And so I was like, no, she's gonna walk away. However, when she does, like there was a moment right after that where she is accosted on the street and assaulted and like beaten badly and ends up in the hospital. And I remember writing it, and the reason she is assaulted has something to do with the mystery, and has nothing to do with the fact that she is gay. However, when I wrote that, I was very, very aware of the trope of always always hurt your gaze. Like I'm not killing her, but it's like close. It's like I was very much aware that like I was like walking this fine line of like almost of like sort of making the reader think that this could be that trope and then pulling it back at the end. And like the experience of having that in like the first draft of the first book I wrote and like having to think that deeply has stuck with me like for future books of like not knowing not just the tropes of like mysteries, but the tropes of queer characters in fiction entirely, and like what not to fall into, and like what am I saying, and what am I not saying, and like yeah, so like that, yeah, it's like that crossroads just has stuck with me for several years now, and probably will.
Was the question tropes that we've written or tropes that we want to write?
Whatever your heart desires for the what you're thinking about with your tropes, whatever. Yeah.
I think about it a lot. Oh, it's not on. Is it on now? There we go. This mic thing, I will accomplish this goal. I think about it a lot. I think I thought about it more with I'm So Not Over You. Like if anybody's read I'm So Not Over You, my main character has been called, especially in the reviews on Goodreads, unlikable and a bitch. Which I mean, fair. But like that came in very clear to me as like there are a lot of rom-coms that have the more whippersnapper, fast, quick, witted female love interest or female main character that we think is like independent. And then when you layer that type of personality on a man or a gay man, it can sometimes come off as like not a great person. Right or wrong, I think it's wrong, but the readers think what they want to think. And once you put a book out there, it's no longer yours, blah, 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 blah. But there are, of course, like lots of tropes that like when you put the level of gayness in there, like I want to explore. Historical romances are a lot harder, and like historical period pieces are a lot harder with like gay characters. Like I am a slut for a female driven period piece. Give me a girl who like wants to buck societal norms and be like an author or whatever, but her like father, she falls for a soldier. Chef's kiss. But like they don't work as well for like gay men. There's a lot of layers in there. Like I know that like our girl Bridgerton is like out here trying to make it a little bit different, but like there's still some. I'm looking at Queen Charlotte over there, just like staring at, because I don't like Bridgerton. I think it's horrible, but Queen Charlotte is good. I watched it in Florida, glued to the TV. My boyfriend was like, "We need to go to dinner." I was like, "No, we can't. That's all. It went off tangent.
Okay. I think I think one of the interesting things is that I too, and these are things that I get tagged in sometimes that say like Timothy Janovsky has a way of writing characters that are so unlikable at the beginning, but they like, by the end, you're still rooting for them. And I'm like, these people are kind of like me. Like, every character that I write has like a little bit of me in them, regardless if I'm writing a piece of fiction or not. And I am. So I always find those comments to be funny because there is a level of identity that comes into play where it is a lot of times people who are just like taking on a voice and hearing it in their head. And this is something I talk to my therapist about all the time. But I love to think about the fact that like in queer fiction and fiction in general, they like you kind of get to put up a mirror to the person who's come to read that story. So a lot of times when I read a story and I think like, oh my gosh, this character is so unlikable, it's because I go away 20 minutes later and I'm like, oh, I do that. I'm looking at my own faults reflected back at me in fiction. And of course, our job as storytellers is to create a character arc that puts them out on the other side. And in romance, it's usually for the better. So like in You're a Mean One, Matthew Prince, I was so interested in taking that hallmark rich guy goes to small town, has to, become a good person, quote unquote, and be worthy of love. I wanted to take that because I had watched those movies for so long with my parents and if I had seen a gay person at all, I saw them as a side character. I didn't see them as the main character, which seems to be a theme of my life. And I was like, I want to write that story and self-insert the queer character at the top of that story. But as far as tropes that I want to write, I'm working on my 6th novel now, and it is a marriage in trouble story. And like a lot of times with my author friends, we talk a lot about like mentor texts, like what books out there are really successful that do this trope really well that you can go and read and just like look at the beats and the storytelling and blah blah blah. And I am having such a hard time, one, because marriage in trouble is not like a huge seller in romance particular, but two, there aren't a lot of examples in it in queer romance at all. And so I'm trying to like dig myself through a minefield of story that I like don't feel like anyone is out there to grab my hand on the other end. And so not saying I'm a trailblazer. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just saying it's hard what we do.
I mean, doesn't Emily Henry have one? Isn't that The Happy Place? Isn't that a marriage in trouble?
I haven't read it.
They're
Emily
engaged.
Okay.
They are engaged.
10 pages in.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Well, they're engaged. So, I mean, well, they're not engaged anymore. They're broken up. Yeah.
I'm very interested by what you said about the reflection in the mirror, and some of the things that we were talking about on the staff was the idea of how you approach writing the queer stories that reflect your own experiences versus approaching queer stories that don't reflect your own experiences within the characters and side characters, and how you approach crafting those queer narratives.
I would say that I tend to, when I come to start writing a book or I am working through edits, that I am often writing the queer world that I see reflected around me, which involves a multiplicity of LGBTQ identities, of cultures and ethnicities and things like that. And so when it comes time to write a story, I'm very much trying to reflect back the experience that I live on the daily and the experience that I hope the world will be like, especially because romance is a place, again, where we suspend our disbelief. We can go to places like in Schitt's Creek that are completely untouched by homophobia, right? Like, and things like that. But also working with authenticity readers who are people who identify within those identities, and they can read your story for biases you didn't know you had, stereotypes you didn't know you might be perpetuating, things like that, where you write these characters and they come out in a free flow and you can do as much research as you want, but if you don't live that experience, you don't know it. And that's kind of hard, where there's always that discussion too about like non-queer authors writing queer stories, right? It's like, is this your story to tell? Well, if you're reflecting your world with respect and authenticity, then go forth and do it. And so I think one of the things that authenticity readers help us do is create characters that feel like people. And as long as these characters feel like people, then we are building a window into a world. If that makes sense.
That was very lovely.
Thank you.
So I'm like one of the non-queer authors writing queer characters, and it carefully, very carefully, and since I'm writing characters that are having adventures in the 1940s, doing my research, and like trying to understand like what the world looked like, what it actually looked like at the time, and not what we think it looked like. Like queer history didn't start with Stonewall, and it's and like trying to understand where the sorry, I just like talked myself
Many thoughts.
Yeah, many thoughts.
Dreadful.
But yeah, just doing my research and doing my due diligence, and also just having lovely people in my life that I can turn to and see like what queer life looks like now, and see how I can reflect that in stories of the 1940s, while at the same time adding the historical accuracy of that time period. The author Hugh Ryan has been fantastic for that. Like he wrote 2 books. One, Brooklyn Was Queer, and The House of D, which is the story of the women's house of detention in New York City, which has been my special interest for like 2 years now. So, and I highly recommend it if you feel like being regularly gut punched with the arc of justice in this country. Yes. That's all I got.
I think that like when I go about this, I don't go out to tell a queer story. I go out to tell a story that has queerness in it. So for me, like the first thing is like craft a good story that's going to give me a biggest advance selling it on proposal. That's like generally like how I honestly go about going to the conversation first, and then figuring out like where does my queerness and where does the idea of queerness fit into this story. I used to be younger and think that like, which I think is a reflection of also just like me being a young person. An author told me this, which is kind of funny. When I first started, I was like, I am only going to ever write queer Black stories. And an author friend of mine who has been in the business for years was like, I'm going to see if you still say that like 10 years from now. Funnily enough, like 8 years from now, I'm not sure I want to continue only doing that because of like many different reasons. But for me, the question is always how much of my queerness do I want to put into it? Or is this going to be a completely different window experience and I'm not going to put a whole bunch of queerness into it? I'm So Not Over You is very much a reflection of a lot of things that I deal with queerness. The Forest Demands Its Due has a boy who burned down the projects in DC through a fire. I didn't do that. So like the level of
You heard it here.
You heard it here. I did not do that. The level of queerness really depends on the story for me, but there's always an underlayer of like, this has a queer character. And so there's some themes that will be in every story.
And I have some individual questions for each of you. And Kosoko, I'll start with you since you were just talking. So you have mentioned that you write books in different categories. I would love to hear you talk about your writing process as you approach different stories for perhaps different audiences that have different staples and beats within that.
Maybe I should have asked for these questions before we came.
I did offer.
You did offer that. I played myself. So for me, there used to be a time when I only wrote YA, and it was a lot different of a process. It was very much, how do I take these ideas and pigeonhole them into being young adult stories? But like young adult stories and adult stories are drastically different in some key ways. I think any story can be a young adult story or an adult story, depending on the themes you want to go about and how you want to tell them. So for me, usually it's like, when I come up with an idea, does this suit the young adult audience more, or does it suit the adult audience more? And then I kind of just like make that tree, and then I decide. If it's young adult, then my story generally has a lot more of emotional and first time beats inside of it. Even if it's like a fantasy story that focuses on magic, there's going to be a lot of first time elements. Love, maybe the first time experiencing power, the first time experiencing a choice of ownership. For my adult stories, it's more of that nuance that like, it's not usually the first time, but there's a nuanced tale about how this power, whatever it is, affects not only your life, but those around them. And that's like kind of how I go about determining where I want the story to fit and how I want to write it. Then the nuances come into like different genre conventions, like we've talked about on this panel, and how I want to subvert those genre conventions or how I want to keep them the same, depending on what my goals are in the end for a book.
Fascinating.
Thank you.
Love it. And Steven, I would love to hear more about your experience writing historical mysteries and what considerations you had for that in crafting your narratives and what research you did into the time period. And do you feel like your background in journalism helped with that at all?
Ooh, so the research I did, so like again, Hugh Ryan, huge fan. Also, like all of my most of my books take place in New York City, which is the most documented metropolis in the history of the world, which is wonderful. So it means that there is a ton of stuff online. They're wonderful. Like there are websites where some wonderful person in the 30s and 40s went and took photographs of every block in New York City, like multiple photographs per block. And now they're all in a map. where you can just go and click a button and it's like, here's what this like corner looked like in like 1939 or 1942. And that shit is gold. So like that's so the the internet is super useful. As for my background as a journalist, yes, in that like journalism helped me learn how to learn and to do research and to not and to like always to never take the like one source as fact and to always like look for to always back things up. Really it's like my background is so like my most of my journalistic career has been spent writing about veterans, writing for a magazine that talks about healthcare and research and writing about the fallout of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And it's like, so I've been writing about PTSD for 20 years. And that has like gone into the actual like narratives and characters of the stories. Like every book I write is about trauma. Like multiple avenues of trauma and how people are dealing with trauma. I flat out in Murder Under Skin, I flat out talk about like trauma of returning World War II vets, intersecting with Will's trauma, intersecting with like my Lillian Pentecost trauma of like dealing with multiple sclerosis. Like it's a whole, multiple sclerosis. Like I recognize like having written about chronic disease for 20 years, that there's very few main characters who have one, like who are like it's very underrepresented, and I was like, I really want to show that. And I stuck her in 1945, where it's not good. It's not a good outcome for MS in 1945. But yeah, that's so yes.
Great. And Tim, you have said that you have a self-appointed certificate in rom-com studies. I'd love to hear more about specifically how your background in comedy and theater had an influence on this and an influence on your love of rom-coms, and potentially what your favorite rom-com is.
Yeah. Ooh, that's a fun question. Well, I was going to say that like so I went to school to study theater and dance, and I've always been really interested in storytelling as a whole. And so since I write stories for the most part that are single POV, first person present tense, it's very much like coming at a story from an actorly perspective, as if I'm going to play a character. I was interviewed by my alumni magazine, and they were asking me like how my theater training prepared me for this career path. And I was like, well, it's kind of like a cheat for getting to play all the roles that probably don't exist in the world and I might never get cast in. Like I can put my characters in. So Matthew Prince is a rich socialite. Like I'm never going to be able to shop at Saks Fifth Avenue, but Matthew can. So I can go and make fake carts and I can pretend I get to wear these lavish outfits. And I think what's really fun about that is that I am kind of like experiencing the beats alongside my character. I probably sound wild when I'm writing, but like I'll go back and like read aloud like text and dialogue just to kind of hear the flow of those stories. And now I'm writing in third person and dual POV, and that gets into all different things. But I think for me, one of the things that I took out of being an actor most and being a comedian is that the more tapped into your emotions you can be, the more you can connect with others. And I think writing romance is an act of vulnerability, no matter how you go about writing those stories. And so if you bring vulnerability to the table, the reader's going to bring it back to you. And so my self-appointed certificate in rom-com studies has more to do with the fact that I found a lot of comfort in those movies when I was young. So like my favorite one is 13 Going on 30, which is the inspiration for New Adult, which comes out in August. And I have a very vivid memory of watching that movie at a family reunion in a hotel suite with my female cousins, because the guys were playing, I don't know what they were doing, but anyway, we were going to watch 13 Going on 30. And I remember sitting there and just like watching Jennifer Gardner like lip sync Love is a Battlefield and being like, oh my gosh, I want to live inside one of these stories. Then I got the opportunity to do it. And the funny thing about that is one, I had to layer queerness onto it. And two, I wrote it from the first person present tense. And oh my gosh, waking up 7 years in the future and not having any idea how you got there or what happened in the past 7 years, that is existential dread to the max. And so I created a narrative problem for myself. But what was great is that I had that theater training. So I was like, oh, okay. So if I was a character and I woke up in this situation, like what steps would I take to resolve this issue? What obstacles probably are going to get in the way? And yeah, so 13 going on 30. I recommend it any day of the week, any time of the year. You can watch it at night. You can watch it during the day. You can watch it in the summer. You can watch it in the winter. Anyway, 13 going on 30. Yep.
Amazing. And I would love to hear from Kosoko and Tim about your experiences with writing for young adults and versus writing for adults, and how you think about your audience as you're doing that.
Well, I was gonna say, like, I mean, I've never published a young adult novel before, so I don't have the reader feedback to know what would have landed and what didn't. But my debut novel, Never Been Kissed, was technically the second novel that I ever wrote to be published, because You're a Mean One, Matthew Prince, was the story that we sold on submission to be published. So I went away and wrote Never Been Kissed on proposal. And I basically said I want to tell a story about this guy who's never been kissed before. It's loosely based on To All the Boys I've Loved Before, and it's set at a drive-in movie theater. And because To All the Boys I've Loved Before is a young adult property, and I just kind of view it as like a rom-com modern classic, I told that story in a way that is accessible to younger readers. And I feel like a YA audience could read that story aspirationally, say like me as a reader, because I mean, aside from some drinking and some mentions of sex, I mean, there's nothing, like you were saying earlier, it's the themes you bring forward in the story that make it accessible to a younger audience. Now, I have a novel coming out in January of 2024 called The Fake Dating Game, which is a fake dating romance on the set of a supermarket sweep style reality show. But it is like, if my books before, let's call it like Never Been Kissed has no heat, Matthew Prince has some, New Adult has some, like this book has like all the chili peppers, right? And so like I was just gonna say that, like, if you're writing these stories, right, like if you're writing about sex and sexuality and relationships, right, if you're writing about sex and sexuality and relationships in a way that is meant to be comforting, this experience is new, it's novel, these firsts, then a young adult audience can read it. If you're writing like these spicy, oh my gosh, I have to get the water pitcher scenes, and they're meant for titillation, titillation.
Yikey.
If they're meant for titillation or pleasure or the enjoyment of the erotic, then that is for adults. I'm sorry I said titillation. That really, truly was probably the worst word I've ever said in my life.
Favorite thing we've ever done together.
That's it. I'm done speaking.
The question was about going about writing for different age groups.
Yeah.
Gotcha. So I have a lot of thoughts, and I'll try to summarize them pretty succinctly. I think about it differently now than I did before. So I think that YA books, positively and negatively, lean a lot more into what like our universe or what like books are wanting nowadays. So like there was a time when every single book in YA had to have romance. Back in the 2010s, no matter what the genre was, there was a romantic arc. Like The Hunger Games doesn't need its romantic arc, but it's in there because I strongly believe it's because it had to be in there. And I think YA readers are looking for more books that don't need it or don't have it as such a major theme anymore. I hear so many teams being like, why does every book have to like end with like romance being the defining characteristic of like a character's arc? So I try to take that into consideration when I'm thinking about a book and thinking about crafting it. And if I want romance to be a heavy theme of it, I understand that there's going to be a little bit of exhaustion in there for its readers. When it comes to adults, I think that we generally are accepting of like a lot more books, going back to what we talked about before about cannibalism. There's more like, there would be more cannibalism adult books because adults can like handle that stuff generally more so than YA readers can. So I think if I want my book to have more of a wild angle to it that explores, not that teenagers cannot explore complicated concepts, but if I want it to be more avant-garde and pushing the envelope a little bit more, then even if it has a younger character, I tend to put it more in the adult category. If I want the book to be a little bit more conventional or to like have very clear comps, my adult books don't have as many clear comps, my YA books clearly do, then I usually put it more in YA.
Cool. And then we're about to get to audience questions, so be forming those thoughts in your head. But one of the last ones I wanted to ask the panel is there a genre that you have not written that you are interested in writing? And how do you think that would go for you? Kosoko, you've written like most everything. So sure.
I really want to write, if I ever can, like a spy genre book. The problem is that like most heavy spy books are very heteronormative and very like straight man, and a lot of them deal very often with like people who are like ex-CIA agents or FBI agents, which actually makes it hard to sell because a lot of editors are looking for like those type of individuals. So like a Jack Reacher who's gay is very, very hard to sell because who is the audience for that when like 90% of Jack Reacher's readers are straight men? Now I gotta write.
We have your audience.
Yeah. Horror. I absolutely would want to write horror, and I've written horror as a playwright. Like I was a playwright for years before I tried novels. But I like, so it's like if mysteries are about like creating a wound in the social fabric, and then by the end you have healed that wound, layer horror on it, and it's you prove that the social fabric was not what you thought it was at all. Like it's totally like, no, the world is not the safe place you think it is. It will never come back to the way that you will never feel safe again after you learn whatever horror teaches you. But yeah, horror is like my second comfort food. Like I'm one of the generation that read Stephen King way too young. Hi, Gen X. Like I read it when I was 9. That was probably not appropriate. But yeah. Yes, I would absolutely love to write horror.
I think I would also probably write horror, and I would want to write a slasher in particular. And that's because what I really like about what I think slashers and romance have in common is they're both very visceral. Somebody's laughing. It's like they have stuff in common, I swear. I find Scream to be a rather... Anyway, it's not important. That's like when Anne Hathaway said her favorite rom-com was Gone Girl. Have you ever seen that? Incredible.
A legend.
I would not say Gone Girl, but I would say that because they're both, their romance and slashers are both very visceral, and they're both give you that like heart palpitation feeling, and that's what I really love when I read fiction. And so I think I would enjoy trying to manifest that in a story that has like more gore in it.
Fascinating. We now have time for audience questions. Does anyone have any questions that they would like to like?
Titulation.
Don't be shy, especially my book club members. I'm eyeing you.
Yeah. So you guys have spoken a lot about like the level of queerness that's represented about your characters in your books. How often do you find that their other identities sort of not overpower, but take more precedence than their queerness in your book? And do you find that ratio of representing both or multiple identities purposeful, or does it happen naturally for you, if at all?
The question, I believe, is a little bit about the intersectionality of writing different queer stories and the thoughts about that.
So for me, my ratio is intentional. My identity and my book character's identity as Black and queer cannot be separated. Queerness and Blackness are both a political identity in this culture, and I cannot separate those from my characters. So the Blackness informs the queerness informs the Blackness. Both of them synergize to inform my characters. My characters would be drastically different if you took out either one of those. And it greatly informs every decision that I make. From Yesterday's History, my first YA about time travel and having a very affluent white family talk about the benefits of time travel, and a Black boy being like, I can't go back to the 60s. There's no good part for that. To my current story, The Forest of Man's Stew, about how Black and queer people throughout history have been used by predominantly white institutions. These books wouldn't be what they were without those two identities.
Yeah, that's a really good answer. I can't top that. So a lot of I think of it a lot of is, so it's like I don't know, everything blurs together. It's like, yes, she's bisexual. She's also like, she comes from a hardscrabble, like she's a teenage runaway who comes from an abusive background. She's a woman working as a detective in the 1940s, which is not totally outside the box. They actually did exist, but like very outside the box. So like these are always constantly like going up, like whichever one is getting foregrounded at any particular scene. But I constantly think of it as like, what can she show to whom? what spaces are safe for her to show which sides of her, who can she talk to honestly. And there's just, and constantly thinking about like the code switching and the code switching and the costumes, and the masks that she puts on for everyone, which I think is a thing you like that she learned as from an abusive childhood, and then like spending 5 years growing up in a circus, is that no, it's all a performance. And it's like, that's how I think of it. It's like, what mask is she showing on, or really with whom can she take which mask off? And then like getting different layers and layers of intimacy, until yeah. And it's like, even with her, with her boss, with Lillian, like there's still like the veneer of professionalism most of the time, and she doesn't talk about her romantic life with Lillian that much, even though it's there, even though they understand, even though it's accepting, it's like not something she discusses. So yeah, that is how I think of it. That's how I think of the intersection.
I think for me, like queerness always enters the narrative from the very beginning. I'm always thinking about that. But like with Never Been Kissed specifically, like when I started writing that story, all I really knew about Ren was that he was freshly 22. He was hoarding these like love notes to all these boys that he almost kissed, like in his email folder. And he kept talking about like why he never felt ready to have that quote unquote first experience. And as the story goes on, I mean, as I was kind of, I like to say that I'm a little bit between a plotter and a pantser, because I will write the full synopsis out and I will know where the story is going. But as far as the character development, I am learning about the character as the story goes on. And so by chapter 3, I was kind of like, oh, okay, wait, I think this character is demisexual. And then by chapter 4, I was like, oh, he doesn't know that. And so I was like, oh, okay. So then I had to go back and start to be like, okay, well, what does he know about being on the A spectrum? Like, how is he going to come to this information? Does he identify with it? And so I think queerness always comes through in however the character decides it's going to relate most clearly to their lives, because I always think about queerness as something that is both an internal self-identification and an external self-identification. So like in Never Been Kissed, his friends, like when he comes out as gay in college, they throw him like a baby gay shower. Like he's our baby gay, and everyone throws him all this love is love merch. Like it's just like, it's a joke to them. And then he's like, oh, okay, well, I can't walk that back now, but I think I might be on the A spectrum, and I might like, so now I'm going to use queer. I think there is both the internal arc and the external arc of every character's queerness every time I sit down to write one.
Another question? Yeah.
How do you write stories that have like coming out, or like racism and homophobia, and make them still like digestible? Like not everyone wants to read a story about homophobia, but it still exists. And still exists.
So the question is, how do you write queer stories with hard topics?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's sorry. It's a difficult question, because what I think is one of the things, like I was talking earlier about like mentor texts, like a lot of times those mentor texts that I go to are cis, straight relationships. And when I'm reading those, there is always these little increments missing in those stories for me, which is when queer folk meet, and if they're allosexual or if they're, what have you, there's always that level of like, if they're not meeting in a queer space, like, is this other person queer? Are they attracted to people of my gender? Are they like, there's just all of these different layers that you have to kind of, or an extra hurdles that you have to go through. Ren in Never Been Kissed says, like, I thought coming out of the closet was supposed to be me like going through the finish line and getting my medal, but like, why does it feel like I'm still winded? Like I'm still running. Like, why is that happening? And it's because like identity is always shifting. And so in something like Never Been Kissed, where it takes place in a small town in Pennsylvania, that's like based on a real town with a real drive-in movie theater, which I actually recently just found out that there's another romance set. Sorry, this is a complete diversion. There's another romance set at this drive-in movie theater from like the 1980s. It was a little Pulp Fiction novel called like Popcorn and Kisses or something like that. It was wild. Anyway, I just learned this. where it's like kind of bordering on, let's say, a more conservative part of Pennsylvania, you know that there are people in this story that hold values that are completely antithetical to the existence of the queer people at the center of this story. And yet you find ways to bring joy to the forefront in every scene. And so I think when I sit down to write, I am trying to manifest as I'm not one of those writers who likes to like punch down on their characters and like, I'm gonna push them down the stairwell and see what happens. I like very much like
We gotta have a little bit of both.
I'm always thinking like, how can I bring joy forward in their life so that by the end, like they are the happiest, most fulfilled version of themselves they can be going forward.
So I talked about how like mysteries create a structure. Like mysteries are a structure, especially whodunits. Like everybody knows how the whodunit works. It's like, here's act one, there's a dead body, the investigators are called in, here's all the suspects. Act two, there's more suspects, there's an action scene, things get muddled. And then, you know, act three, there's a climax and we solve everything. It's like, it's a really comforting structure. So I'm like, here's a comforting structure. I promise that by the end, we're going to find out who done it. But also on the way, we're going to talk about a whole lot of messed up stuff that happened back then and is still happening today. Oh boy. Yeah, the next book in the series, Murder Crossed Her Mind, it comes out in December. Like I get to talk about the kickoff of the culling of gay people from the State Department, which was happening years before they ever gave it the name the Lavender Scare. It started in 1947, not the 1950s. It's really pre-McCarthy. And I get to like talk about that and like how it affects people and like the crackdowns on gay clubs in New York. But I get to do it in this little comforting space of a murder mystery. And also it's very nice that I have Will as my point of view protagonist, who has she's very clearly like throughout the series, like she is writing this. We know she's writing this and she knows she's writing this. And so she says, she in the first book, she's like, I am making choices as to what I include and what I don't include and what language I include and what language I don't include. So I basically like, you will never hear certain words in these books. You'll know people are saying them, but she's going to talk around them. And not in a way that like is going to absolve anybody. But just in a way so that you don't have that stuff on the page hitting you in the face every time. So I get to talk about it, but like I get to talk about it sideways sometimes and with humor, even if it is gallows humor.
I love that. Yeah.
I make very intentional choices about when it comes to those themes, about the difficult topics of what I include and what I do not include and how I do it. Specifically, the two easiest ones are like racism and homophobia. When it comes to racism in a book, I typically am very going to be on the front page about it and make the reader confront that, partially because I know that my YA audience, and as a responsibility, especially for YA books, is that YA books are sometimes the first time a teenager will see something and inform their point of view of something. So I need you to understand how discomforting this is and how wrong it is. And also my audience is mainly white people, and I need them to sit in that discomfort about a specific scene. When it comes to like homophobia, I also recognize that like homophobic words and those scenes can be incredibly triggering and that books are a place of safety. So if I'm going to deal with that and have it on the page, generally there's going to be some level of cleverness about it, or the main character who's ever suffering from it comes out on top or some way, shape, or form. In The Force Demands Its Due, literally on the first chapter deals with the main character being the victim of a hate crime at his school and him being taken to the principal's office and them specifically saying, why did you punch this guy? And he mentions how they call him the F word and they also call him a bitch, and the teacher doesn't understand why. And he's like, people have called me the F word before, but everyone knows I'm smart enough. No one should call me a stupid bitch. And so it's very clear who this character is and how we deal with these topics. And I want to make it sure that these people understand that, like, I don't believe in like going high when they go low anymore. Like we should be punching Nazis. I'm very firmly in favor of this. I will never do it because I am a Black man, but I do think there are people that should, and I want that to be represented inside of books.
We have time for one more question. Do we have any audience questions? So the question that we're ending on is, what do you want to see more of in queer books out there? Which is also, for the record, the question we always end our club meetings with. So this is a special love shout out to our Queer in the Narrative friends.
I want to see more queer villains that are actually like nuanced and good. I think for like a recommendation, even though they're not officially a queer villain, though I strongly think they are, is Jason Momoa's character in Fast X. I strongly believe that character is pansexually coded. And if anybody else who has seen this movie, please agree with me. And if you disagree with me, you're wrong. So just like tell me. But I want like nuanced queer characters that are villains that like they're like their queerness doesn't make them a villain. They are just gonna like shoot you in the face, but also like they like men.
You are right about Jason Momoa. I haven't seen the movie. I've just seen the trailers, but yeah, obviously. I just want to see more in more genres. Like across, I don't want like the like queer horror to be like a little tiny like section. I want it to be and I would love more exploration of like the tropes that happen when there are queer characters in like horror or in sci-fi or in, you know, Jack Reacher style spy books, and like to subvert and break them apart and just give me the full range of things. Yeah.
I think for me, I just want more like wackadoodle, like off the wall, like logic has been thrown out the window. Like those are my favorite kind of books to just kind of slip into. I've already said titulation. It doesn't matter what I say now. But I just think that like some of my favorite books of the last couple of years, like I really loved, it's called Just Like Magic by Sarah Hogel. And this woman like falls in love with the personification of the Christmas spirit, like the holiday spirit, like he is summoned through a gramophone. I think that is hysterical. And there is something very queer about that as well. And
So
it's
true, Bestie.
right. Like if you're just falling in love with like a spirit that is mostly just particles every other time of the year, then like that's gay. I'm so sorry. And so I just want like more wacky bananas books.
I love it. I love it. This has been probably my favorite event of the month, and you all have been wonderful. Thank you all for being here with us this evening and supporting Smile. We're now going to take a moment to set up our signing table. If you want to purchase copies of the book, or if you have brought your copies with you, we have copies upstairs. I'm going to set a little table for our authors to sit and sign at, and I appreciate all of you being here. If you were able and willing to set your chair to the side to help our staff members set them aside, that would be great. And we appreciate you being here, and we'll see you the next time.